In a family bound by outdated traditions and gender roles, one woman's quiet rebellion sparked a chain of events that would forever change the dynamics of her marriage and family. When she stood up to her husband's family, challenging the patriarchal norms they had long upheld, she didn't just fight for herself, she fought for every woman who had been silenced. This is a story of courage, transformation, and the power of standing up for what's right. Subscribe to the channel to begin today's story of empowerment. I had always known that my marriage to Thomas would be different. We weren't perfect, but I never thought it would come to a point where I felt like I was invisible in my own home. Just another servant in a family who believed in strict, outdated gender roles. It wasn't that Thomas was abusive. Far from it. He wasn't unkind. But there were moments, subtle ones, where he slipped into the mold of his father, Charles. It was a regular Saturday. One of those rare evenings where we had no special occasion to celebrate. Just a quiet dinner at home. Thomas and I had been married for 3 years. And although we hadn't fought much, there was always an undercurrent of tension. I was still adjusting to the differences between how I grew up and how he and his family lived. I'd been raised to believe in equality, that a marriage was a partnership, and that respect between partners was vital. His family, however, saw things differently. His father, Charles, was the type of man who believed that the man should run the house. His word was final, and the women were there to serve. Charles's wife, Linda, never seemed to speak up. She would always silently stand by him, never questioning the traditions that kept her bound to the role of a dutiful wife. Then there was Jason, Thomas's brother, who mirrored his father in almost every way. Loud, opinionated, and sure that women should know their place. His wife, Emily, was always so sweet, but there was something about her, a nervous energy that made me wonder if she was always waiting for someone to tell her to keep quiet. I didn't grow up in that kind of environment. My parents raised me to believe that women had a voice, that we should be seen as equals to our husbands. And so, while I knew Thomas's family had some very old-fashioned ideas, I thought as long as Thomas wasn't like them, I could accept it. I was wrong. The dinner that changed everything started out like any other. I spent the entire day cooking, not because anyone expected me to, but because I enjoyed it. I liked making a home feel welcoming. And honestly, I wanted to impress Thomas's family. I had prepared roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, collard greens, cornbread, the works. I had spent hours on it, making sure everything looked perfect. The table was set beautifully with candles, and the smell of food filled the house, creating an atmosphere of warmth. I was proud of what I had created, hoping they would appreciate the effort I had put in. When everyone arrived, the usual pleasantries were exchanged. Charles made some comment about how Thomas had really lucked out with me, his way of saying, "Good job finding a wife who can cook and clean." I smiled through it, just like I had done so many times before. But then, as we sat down at the table, something happened that stopped me cold. I had placed my plate on the table last, right in front of my seat, ready to sit down and join the family for the meal. But before I could, I felt a hand reach across me. Charles, without a word, he took my plate, lifted it from in front of me, and passed it down the table to Jason. "You eat after the men," he said, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. I froze. I thought I had misunderstood. Surely, I was hearing things. Who says something like that in the year 2025? But as I glanced around, no one seemed shocked. Jason had already dug into his food, like nothing had happened. Linda stared at her plate in silence, as she always did. Emily looked uncomfortable but kept her head down. And then there was Thomas, my own husband. He didn't look at me with shock, disbelief, or even anger at his father. No, he just gave me a look. It was the kind of look that told me, "Don't make a scene." And then, in a quiet voice, he murmured, "It's tradition." Something inside me snapped. I wasn't raised to be someone's afterthought. I wasn't going to sit there in my own home, waiting for permission to eat, like I was some kind of servant. But I knew if I blew up right then and there, they would just dismiss me as being overly sensitive. So, I didn't say anything. I just sat there, still as stone. While they ate, I didn't reach for another plate. I didn't touch the food I had spent hours making. I just sat there, watching. I watched as Thomas laughed at something Jason had said. I watched Charles take second helpings of everything, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting there, hungry, waiting for my plate. I watched Linda eat silently, like she had done her entire life. And I let my anger simmer. The next morning, I woke up early and sent out a group text to the whole family. Dinner at our place again next Sunday. My treat. Thomas looked surprised when I mentioned it. Another dinner? Are you sure? You were pretty quiet last night, he said. I smiled, though I wasn't feeling particularly cheerful. I just want to make sure your family knows how much I appreciate them, I said, knowing that my quiet fury had only just begun. The next Sunday arrived, and I threw myself into the preparations once again. This time, however, my mindset had completely shifted. It wasn't just about impressing Thomas's family with the food I cooked. It was about sending a message. A message that they needed to hear. I had already made up my mind that I would do things differently. I wouldn't be the obedient wife who simply accepted whatever was thrown my way. If they were going to insist on tradition, then I was going to show them how that tradition felt when the roles were reversed. I spent hours preparing the meal. But this time, it was different. I went all out: prime rib, garlic butter shrimp, scalloped potatoes, homemade bread, roasted asparagus. The kind of meal that would make anyone's mouth water the moment they walked through the door. By the time the family arrived, the house smelled like roasted garlic and butter. And the table was set beautifully. Every dish steaming hot and ready to be served. I had no doubt they would be impressed by the spread. As usual, the men entered first. They were all loud and opinionated. As expected, Charles immediately took his seat at the head of the table, and Jason followed suit. As they sat, I stood up and walked over to their side of the table, ready to execute my plan. Just as they reached for their forks, I did the unexpected. I took their plates right out from under them. One by one, without a word, I handed the plates to the women, Linda, Emily, and myself. You eat after the women, I said, keeping my voice as calm and even as Paul had been the week before. The silence was instantaneous. The men froze, their forks hovering in the air, unsure of how to react. Charles's jaw tightened. Jason scoffed, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. And Thomas? He blinked at me in confusion, the shock on his face clear. Babe, what are you doing? He asked, his voice low. I picked up my fork, taking a slow, deliberate bite, all while keeping my eyes on Charles, who was now visibly angry. It's tradition, I said calmly, repeating the same words Thomas had used the week before. Paul pushed back from the table, his face reddening. We don't do things like this, he muttered under his breath. I chewed slowly, savoring the moment. Exactly, I said, meeting his eyes. Jason, who was getting more red in the face by the second, looked like he was about to explode. This is stupid, he muttered, barely able to contain his frustration. I tilted my head, staring at him with a calm that felt foreign to me but was necessary for what I needed to do. It wasn't stupid last week when you ate first, was it? I asked, my voice just sharp enough for them to feel the weight of my words. For the first time, I saw a small flicker of change in Emily's eyes. The quiet, sweet woman who had always stayed in the background looked at me with something resembling admiration. A faint smile on her lips that she quickly covered with a cough. I caught it. For the first time, Emily was looking at her husband, Jason, as if she were seeing him for who he really was. Linda, too, did something she had never done before. She picked up her fork before Charles did, though she still looked nervous. But it was a start. She was breaking free from the silent compliance that had defined her life for so long. And I couldn't help but feel a little proud. As for the men, they were uncomfortable, hungry, yes, but powerless in a way that I hadn't expected. They sat there, their faces a mix of confusion and anger, unable to do anything but watch as the women began to eat. When I finished my meal, I leaned back in my chair and wiped my mouth slowly. Deliberately. The room was still silent. Since the women cooked, the men can do the dishes, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Paul's face was priceless. Jason actually laughed, thinking I was joking. But when I didn't move, when I didn't start clearing the plates like the obedient little housewife they had always expected, Jason realized I wasn't kidding. Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting between me and his father. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, with a sigh, Thomas stood up and started collecting the plates. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. The dinner had ended, but the message had been delivered. I wasn't going to sit by and let the outdated traditions of this family dictate how I was treated. I wasn't just doing this for me, I was doing it for Emily. For Linda, for all the women in this family who had been silenced for far too long. The men may have done the dishes that night, but it was a small victory for the women. It was a reminder that change could come, even in the most deeply ingrained traditions. And as I watched Thomas carry the dishes into the kitchen, I couldn't help but wonder if he truly understood the lesson I had just taught. The evening was over, but the tension lingered long after the last plate was cleared away. The men had reluctantly done the dishes, and the women had quietly observed, their faces a mix of confusion and contemplation. As the guests began to leave, I couldn't help but notice the way Emily was looking at me. For the first time, she seemed to see something in me that hadn't been there before, something strong. Something unapologetic. Thomas and I were alone now, and the silence between us felt heavier than I could bear. I leaned against the counter, watching him clean up. I had expected some sort of confrontation, some sort of argument about what had just transpired. But he seemed withdrawn, lost in his thoughts. It was as if the man I had married wasn't the same man who had just sat at that table. Thomas, are you okay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he swirled the drink in his glass, staring at it like it held all the answers. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and turned to face me. What the hell was that? He asked, his voice tense. You humiliated my dad. I felt my chest tighten at his words. Humiliated him? Or did I just show him what it feels like to be on the other side? I asked, my voice sharp, but calm. Thomas's face twisted in frustration. You made everyone uncomfortable, he muttered. Good, I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. Maybe they needed to be uncomfortable. For once, they had to see what it feels like to be treated like second-class citizens. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly trying to process everything that had just happened. I don't understand why you had to make it a whole thing, he said. Why couldn't you just let it go? I couldn't just let it go, Thomas, I said, stepping closer to him. This isn't just about one meal. It's about years of conditioning. It's about the way your family has treated me, and the way they treat the women around them. You think this is how things work. But it isn't. I'm not some submissive wife. And I'm not going to sit here and let your family's outdated traditions dictate how I'm treated. His expression softened, but there was still a look of disbelief in his eyes. I don't get it, he said, shaking his head. You always turn everything into a fight. No, I replied, my voice steady. I'm not turning anything into a fight. I'm finally making it as big as it needs to be. There was a long silence between us. And for the first time in months, I wondered if I had misjudged Thomas. Had I been wrong about him? Or was he just too deep in his father's world to see how damaging these traditions really were? The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text message from Emily. It was early, but I had a feeling I knew what this message would be about. I glanced over at Thomas, who was still asleep, and slipped out of bed to call her. Hey, Emily, I said, my voice low. Can we talk? She asked, her voice quiet and shaky. I could hear the hesitation in her tone, and it broke my heart. Of course, I replied, leading her into the conversation. I wanted to say thank you, she said after a long pause. Thank you for standing up to them. For showing me that I'm not crazy for thinking this isn't normal. My heart swelled with emotion. Emily, You deserve better than this. I said, my voice thick with empathy. What's going on isn't right. And you don't have to accept it. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do. Mark's been getting worse. He never hits me, but he controls everything. What I wear, what I do, who I talk to, and when I try to speak up. He tells me I'm emotional, that I need to calm down. And Charles backs him up every time. My stomach twisted with anger at the thought of Emily enduring this. You don't have to stay in that situation, I said firmly. You can leave. You deserve to feel like an equal. To feel safe and respected. She let out a shaky breath. But what if I don't know where to go? You come here, I said without hesitation. You pack a bag, get in your car, and get out of there before he comes home. Don't stay in that house for another night. Emily was quiet, but I could hear the determination in her voice when she finally responded. Okay. I ended the call and began preparing for Emily's arrival. I pulled out blankets and set up the guest room. I made sure everything was ready for her. But before I could call her back to check in, Thomas walked into the room. His eyes immediately narrowed as he dropped his keys on the counter. Who was that? He asked. His tone flat. I hesitated, unsure if I should tell him. But I knew this wasn't his business. Not now. Just girl talk, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He stared at me for a long moment, suspicion creeping into his eyes. What's going on with her? I shrugged. She's fine, just needed to talk. Thomas didn't say anything else. But something had shifted in his demeanor. I could see the conflict in his eyes. The strain of the moment weighing heavily on him. He was no longer the man I had married. Maybe he never had been. Or perhaps he was just realizing. Too late. The depth of the issues that had been simmering in our marriage and in his family. A few hours later, Emily arrived, suitcase in hand, her eyes swollen from crying but also filled with a new kind of hope. I gave her a tight hug, whispering that she was safe now. She didn't say much, but I could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders as she stepped into my home. That night, we talked about everything. The years of silence, the abuse of power, and the feeling of being trapped. For the first time in a long while, Emily smiled without fear, and it was in that moment that I realized how powerful it was to stand up for what was right. The following day, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, I was met by Thomas. His face was pale, and his eyes were searching. Uncertain, he had clearly been torn all night, trying to process everything that had happened. I don't know what to do anymore, he admitted, his voice raw. I've been so blinded by everything my family's taught me. But I see it now. You were right. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But it felt like we were on the cusp of something new. Something better. The power dynamics that had defined his family for generations were beginning to crack. And with it came the chance for real change, not just for me, but for everyone who had been silenced. As for Emily, she filed for divorce shortly after, leaving Mark and taking the first steps toward a life where she could finally breathe. And in time, Linda, Thomas's mother, found the courage to leave Charles as well, starting over in a small apartment. The journey was far from over, but the first step had been taken. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more life stories and real-life experiences.